Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 49th week of 2013. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Ron Szoke and David Green. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who has been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20-some years that we have been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is December 6, 2013, the eve of Noam Chomsky's 85th birthday. Our friend, the late Alex Coburn, used to say that the two greatest blows suffered by the American empire occurred on December 7th. One was Pearl Harbor, the other was Noam Chomsky's birthday, a few years before Pearl Harbor. It is the anniversary, tomorrow is the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and I do have a comment about that if we have time later, but I would like to begin today at least with a certain reflection on our intellectual mentor for this program, that is Noam Chomsky. I've decided that the title for the program in my notes would be the News from Neptune, the Prophet Without Honor edition, with reference to the first century Jewish prophet who is reported to have said, "Prophets are not without honor except in their own country." Find that in the Gospel of Mark, if you're looking for it. And in a recent interview, Chomsky actually took up this theme. He discussed political thought, political discourse, with reference to the unique notion of prophecy in the Abrahamic religions, that is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Elsewhere, in the classical world, for example, prophecy is taken to mean telling the future, fortune-telling. You're going to prophesize about what's going to happen down the road. But the notion inherited from the religion of ancient Israel is quite different. Prophets have other concerns. Prophets, the told tagline was, prophets are not foretellers, but forthtellers. That is, they are supposed to proclaim something, not about the future, except maybe in a roundabout way of saying what's going to happen if things keep going on the way they are right now, which is what the prophets are most interested in. Chomsky, in this interview, said, and I'm quoting here, "The word prophet is a very bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word, navi. Nobody knows what it means, but today they'd be called dissident intellectuals. They were giving geopolitical analysis, arguing that the acts of the rulers were going to destroy society." He's talking about the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. They condemned the acts of evil kings. They called for justice and mercy to orphans and widows, and so on. I don't want to say it was all beautiful. Dissident intellectuals aren't all beautiful. You read Sakharov, who is sometimes appalling, the Russian intellectual of the last generation, or Solzhenitsyn, another one. And the Nevi'im, as the prophets, the Nevi'im of ancient Israel, were treated the way dissident intellectuals always are. They weren't praised, they weren't honored, they were imprisoned, like Jeremiah. They were driven into the desert. They were hated. Now, at the time, there were intellectuals, prophets, who were very well treated. They were the flatterers of the court. Centuries later, they were called the false prophets. People who criticized power in the Jewish community were regarded the way Ahab, King Ahab, treated the prophet Elijah. You're a traitor. You've got to serve power. You can't argue that the policies that Israel is following are going to lead to its destruction, which I thought then and still do. I particularly admired, said Chomsky, Amos' comments that he's not an intellectual. I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. I'm a simple shepherd. So he translated prophet correctly. He's saying I'm not an intellectual. He was a simple farmer and he wanted just to tell the truth. I admire that. It seems to me that's not a bad description of what Chomsky has done for a good long time, and he has certainly in many cases been without honor in his own country on the matter. I once heard him tell a story about doing his original work on linguistics, which established his reputation as one of the leading intellectuals of his generation. He did for the sciences, the science of language, roughly what Einstein did for physics. That is, rethought it, put it on a new basis, a new way of going about it, a new way of understanding it. And he said that when he was doing his initial work on language, he had to learn some mathematics because the notion of language that he thought, and is now generally accepted, to be accurate, has to do with the same sort of structures that recursive functions in mathematics have. So he said, I had to learn the mathematics to do that. And he said it was quite interesting because when he tried to get his hand on the mathematics and then applied it to the discussion of language, he said mathematicians responded to it by wondering if he got the right answer. Did he get to the right conclusion from his investigation of mathematics? He said at the same time he was trying to get a handle on American foreign policy and to talk about American history and politics as it pertains to current questions. But when he talked about that, he said the historians didn't ask, did he get the right answer? The historians asked, where did he get his degree in history? And it seems to me that's an important point and an important aspect of the ideological structure within which we try to understand contemporary history and politics. Chomsky has been a great help in doing that. So you're watching News from Neptune, the Prophet Without Honor edition, and we'll begin with whichever one of you gentlemen. Ron, you got some things you want to say about this?
Yeah, I have two things to say. Late Mandela and early Chomsky. We should take note that Nelson Mandela died yesterday, and the presses, the media are full of it today, and a lot of praise for him. There's this suggestion constantly that he kind of single-handedly prevented race war in South Africa, and I'm not sure that's true. Of course, whenever this happens, there's always an immediate reaction pointing out that he was considered a terrorist by in American official circles for years. And this silly notion that if you praise anything that he did, then you're committed to approving anything that he ever said or did, which is not true. I don't take that attitude toward Mandela or toward Chomsky or anyone else. And so I'm not committed to that. And maybe we'll come back to the difference between a prophet and a oracle or a soothsayer, which would be interesting. But anyway, I want to talk about, just say a few things about the first 40 years of Noam Chomsky, born in 1928 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, whose father was a recognized Hebrew scholar, and Chomsky's bachelor's degree was actually, or dissertation or thesis, whatever it was actually about Hebrew. His master's degree also. Then he went to, well, all three of his degrees are from Penn, actually. And then he went to Harvard as a fellow, or whatever they call them, 51 to 55, and then went over to MIT, where he's been since. So Chomsky was in this period of sensitivity to larger moral, political, historical questions from about 19 43 to 53, that is at the end of World War II, and this may help us understand some of his subsequent positions and concerns. He concentrated mainly on technical questions in linguistics during the 50s. My first encounter with Chomsky was in this book, The Dissenting Academy, edited by Theodore Roszak, which was mainly about the response of intellectuals and academics to the Vietnam War, and a very eloquent essay at the end of it by Chomsky about the responsibility of intellectuals, which I understand had been delivered as a lecture somewhat earlier at Harvard and then published in the New York Review of Books and wound up in this book, which I found very interesting. The responsibility of intellectuals, of course, is to tell the truth and to uncover the things that are being misstated or ignored in the official media and by those intellectuals and academics who have built careers mainly by sucking up to authorities, the wealthy, the powerful. And he's very much against that, and I think that's a good emphasis. He continued to work on technical questions in linguistics in the 50s, writing syntactic structures, aspects of the theory of syntax, Cartesian linguistics, and so on, embracing something that was very unfashionable, at least at the time, a kind of rationalistic view of language, endorsing what came to be called innate ideas, as found in Plato and Leibniz, and perhaps in Humboldt, the elder Humboldt, as well, but I don't know much about that whole area. Anyway, he reoriented the entire field in linguistics by endorsing the notion of deep structures of language and the inherent creativity of language users, the notion that, well, which was very interesting and exciting to me at the time. In his review of B.F. Skinner's 1957 book, Verbal Behavior, which came out in 1959, he shows, in a way that was very exciting to me at the time, that language could not be really built in the way that Skinner and other would-be empiricists thought it could be, because there's never enough information available to create the kind of sentences that people can produce endlessly by some process of conditioning. It just it can't work. There's not enough stimulus available to ever do that. But so sentence production is not a Markov process, meaning that the syntax of language, the words that we put one after the other, cannot be under the control of some probabilistic mechanism and shifting from one phase or stage to another. And there has to be something that he calls a deep structure. And there's been a lot of controversy about that among philosophers, for example, who were of a more empiricist point of view. And I don't want to reopen that kind of question. I'm not really competent to discuss it, but it's one of the most distressing things about Chomsky is this emphasis on what used to be taken as rationalism, and thinking that it's somehow hostile to empiricism and positivism and so on, which it may very well be, but again, I don't want to enter into that kind of discussion. I like to think of myself as being more of an empiricist, but who knows? There has to be a place for the rationalist also, I'm convinced, so maybe I'm just confused about all of that. Anyway, with the advent of the war in Vietnam, Chomsky, along with a lot of other intellectuals and academics, saw that this was a really ill-founded project, and there was a lot of alienation of the intellectuals and academics of the time that are reflected in this book and a lot of other writings of the time. And his interests then shifted, especially after, I think, his retirement, to this political kind of question after he had done his really fundamental revolutionary work in linguistics. Books on linguistics came to be filled with these inverted branching tree programs illustrating the relations of different grammatical categories to each other. And it was really a revolution in the whole subject. But anyway, Chomsky then became much better known as a dissident about American foreign policy and militarism and what we can only call imperialism around the world. Then a lot of criticism of him, of course, arose. One of the striking things to me was when he was interviewed by Charlie Rose once on PBS. Rose really beshat himself by the way he treated Chomsky, and wanting to know everyone to know that he was having no part of this guy, and it was really very an amazing scene to see how Charlie Rose could not extricate himself from this hostility to Noam Chomsky and what Chomsky was saying. So the way of a dissenter and a prophet is sometimes hard, and he's without honor in his own country. But I'm really amazed and pleased at the way that Chomsky has stayed with it and is saying things that everyone needs to hear. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. Very helpful. Comments, David, on Ron's take here?
Charlie Rose, at his most frustrated level in this interview that Ron referred to, which I think took place in 2003, Charlie Rose threw up his hands. Well, maybe he didn't literally throw up his hands, but figuratively threw up his hands and said to Chomsky, "How is it you know so much about so many things?"
And Ron in discussion used a technical term that we use about intellectual discourse.
Yeah,
that's
right.
all too necessary too often. Yeah, there's a great deal there in terms of Chomsky's career. I only wondered, Ron, you mentioned the article, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, and how important that was. I would probably suggest that the Chomsky's political work, which did in some sense follow on to his initial scientific work in language, didn't really wait for his retirement. I mean, he was involved in that for many years. Certainly, he had been already for a while at the time the Responsibility of Intellectuals appeared. What was the year of that? What year did that first appear?
Well, there were two earlier versions. This is 68, and he doesn't give a definite date, but there was a lecture at Harvard, and something appeared in the New York Review of Books in the preceding year or two.
That's yes, and he was already known as a member of the small group, much smaller than was later remembered, of academics who were opposing the Kennedy-Johnson War in Vietnam. But he was an important voice of the anti-war movement in the 60s already, when he was a mere stripling of 40 years. So it was, he's been around for a while, thank goodness.
Aren't there some political writings in his juvenilia? I mean, going back to when he was a boy.
Interestingly so, he says that in fact the most important part of his political education was the newsstand that an uncle of his had in New York. and he would take the train into New York from Philadelphia and hang around in the newsstand reading the foreign press and so forth when he was 10 years old. Yeah. And at the age of 10, he wrote an article on the fall of Barcelona to Franco's forces. 10 years old, because he found accounts of it only in the foreign press that he was reading in his uncle's store. It was not in the American press anyplace, and that seems to have been his first political writing as such. He was immersed into a world of leftists, often immigrant leftists, many of them Jewish, living in New York and New Jersey, and there were intense debates within this group between communists and anarchists, between Trotskyists and Stalinists, between various forms of Marxists and anti-Marxists, and his political education really took place there, I think, and had made him a lifelong, as he calls it, libertarian socialist. And that's a very misleading title right now in America, because when he used it first about himself, libertarian had a European meaning, which essentially meant democratic. Libertarian socialist contrasted with the authoritarian socialists of the Leninist stripe. Leninism, after all, remember, is a sort of is a right-wing Marxism that says if the revolution is going to be made, it's going to be made by a party with an internal structure and a direction strong enough to take political action, i.e. an authoritarian organization. Against that, there was a great movement in Lenin's own time to say that no, if socialism isn't democratic, it isn't socialism at all, and therefore Leninist socialism, Leninist Marxism is a contradiction in terms. And these arguments were taken very seriously by people who understood them in Chomsky's youth, and he came down very clearly on the side of libertarian socialism long before the generation of Ron Paul ever thought of another meaning for libertarianism on these shores. David, you got comments on this? You want to?
Well, they would only sort of be identical with what I'm going to say anyway.
Okay.
So maybe
Sure.
we could just sort of soldier on here.
Why don't you do that?
In terms of I just have a list of things that
Okay.
that I typed up when I found out about the topic of this show, and some
Okay.
of this will repeat what's already been said, but it turned out to be number 14. That's not usually a number I like all that much, but 14.
You and Shakespeare. I mean,
Yeah,
come
right,
on. It's,
right.
that's not bad.
But,
That's not a bad precedent.
What did Shakespeare had to do with 14?
Sonnets?
Oh, I see.
14-line sonnets.
Oh, 14-line
Yeah,
sonnets,
you
okay.
got a political sonnet there on your page.
Okay, so here's my sonnet. I didn't know I was doing a sonnet.
Just opposite to Moliere's man, you didn't realize you'd been speaking poetry all
Yeah,
these years. He
exactly.
thought, yes, rather
But
than prose.
yeah, I mean these 14. Some of these there's more than one point in some of these 14 points, but I guess that's the kind of
All right.
cheating you have to do to stay within the sonnet boundaries. But
A good answer to Wilson, huh?
So the first point is that Chomsky to this day, from his youth, claims to be a Zionist, a cultural Zionist, and he reminds us that the origins of the Zionist movements were not simply in a desire for a Jewish state, which came somewhat later, but people who thought that Jews should return or go to Palestine to revive a Jewish culture, and Chomsky was very much a part of that culture through his father's work in Hebrew grammar and through his own work in Hebrew grammar. He would still claim to be a Zionist on that level, and that's in the current context in which Zionist is a dirty word. Chomsky isn't going to be the kind of person to deny that he is a Zionist on that level, and he takes a certain amount of heat even from people who he joins in the pro-Palestinian cause. Number two, in that light, he's critical of a Jewish state. He was critical of a Jewish state, which was not central to the Zionist movement until the early 1900s, and really not central to American Zionism until the 1940s. In fact, he's critical of all states as an anarchist, and that's important to understand, that his criticism of a Jewish state, or of the need for a Jewish state, is consistent with his criticism of all states, all governments. Number three, as a libertarian socialist, he emphasizes the Enlightenment heritage in a somewhat different way than most of what we learn in school by having brought to the attention of his public the work of Wilhelm von Humboldt and the limits of state power. Or is that the right word? The limits of state something, yeah. And brings, in terms of his understanding of libertarian socialism in this von Humboldt context, I think is consistent with his views of language and human development. I mean, even though Chomsky doesn't like to necessarily literally connect his political views to his linguistic views,
right.
I think that in the work of von Humboldt, who was a linguist also, and an anarchist of a sort, I think we can see that connection along with in many other contexts. Number 4, a critic of behaviorism, as Ron mentioned, and in the context of not just the 1950s, and I was going to mention the article that the critique of Skinner that Chomsky wrote in the 1950s, and in the context of going into in the 60s and even the late 60s and even into the early 70s, I think it's important to understand how much sway the behaviorist work of B.F. Skinner still had on college campuses in this country. He was dominant over Chomsky in psychology, maybe not in linguistics itself, but in psychology. And Chomsky argued from early on that there were good reasons for that. There were good reasons in liberal academia for people to prefer this idea of behavior control over this idea of innate properties. And it was pretty well drummed into liberals in the 1950s and 60s that the hope for the future was to be able to build an environment which could modify human behavior in pretty systematic ways. And these were views that Chomsky always opposed, but have maintained their sway to this present day. Whatever the falling out of fashion of B.F. Skinner, his legacy in psychology and in education is still felt for the worse. We live in a very technocratic, behaviorally manipulative society, which goes very much against Chomsky's teaching and his views of human nature and language. And this goes into my 5th point, which just has to do with schooling and the nature of schooling. Chomsky's Deweyan background has having gone to a Deweyan school at Temple University in Philadelphia from the age of 2 to about the age of 12. And his understanding of the history of education and formal schooling in this country as being, at the way he summarizes it at the most fundamental level, it was a way of, in the 19th century, is a way of getting fairly independent-minded farmers to think and behave like factory workers. That's an oversimplification, I think, of the common school movement in this country, but it has a lot to say about it. Number 6 has already been referred to, his criticisms of Bolshevism and what he called state capitalism in the Soviet Union. He's also been a critic or dismissive of Marxist theory and thought in a lot of ways. I would say the only caveat, or one of the few caveats I have towards Chomsky's approach to understanding Marxism, which we refer to all the time on this show, of course, he has a very, I think, instinctive and practical understanding of class struggle. Of course, he doesn't like to put it in Marxist terms. I'd like to hear more Chomsky respond to the work of someone like David Harvey and his treatment of Marx and his reading of Capital and his, I think, David Harvey's very important work in getting back to the basics of how Marx encouraged us to think about the basics of capitalism is in terms of exchange and commodification and money and so forth. But Chomsky tends to sort of not go there. Although I think if he did, he would have his own practical understanding. But I think Harvey's work is important in his belief in the dialectical aspect of Marxist thinking as being important. I do also, and Chomsky, again, doesn't really go there. Number 7 would be to emphasize Chomsky's importance as a historian of U.S. foreign policy, as the preeminent historian, academic, scholarly historian of U.S. foreign policy, especially since World War II, completely without honor in this. It isn't just a matter that Chomsky has read what other people wrote and summarized it, which he does. He did the basic original research in terms of understanding the grand area strategy after World War II, right along with William Applebaum Williams and Gabriel Kolko and people like that. But just as Kolko isn't really recognized either as a preeminent historian by the establishment in this country, neither is Chomsky. And I think it's important. It's obvious why that's the case, but he's no less a historian for not being an academic historian or for not being a professor in a history department somewhere. His criticism, number 8, his criticism of U.S. foreign policy, it's already been referred to, neoliberalism, and again, his critique of Bolshevism and Soviet state capitalism, his analysis of the Cold War in that context. Number 9, the preeminent historian, along with Edward Said, in the 70s and 80s of the history of Zionism and Israel and the establishment of the Jewish state, which was originally published in his work, The Fateful Triangle, in 1983. Again, an original and singular scholarly treatment of the history of Israel, Zionism and Israel to that time. Number 10, his critic of, and here I'm going to sort of go into a little different approach, his very much emphasized critiques of the great man approach to history and activism and leadership. Chomsky is always honest about what he says, what he likes and doesn't like, without necessarily even being personal. One interesting thing that I heard Chomsky say recently is that he really couldn't listen to Martin Luther King's speeches. He couldn't listen to the rhetorical style of Martin Luther King as a leader. And I think it isn't that he was critical of Martin Luther King as a leader. He wants us to understand history as coming from the bottom up and as leaders like Martin Luther King not being responsible for the changes, the waves that they ride. And again, the next point, 11 out of my 14 points, again gets back to his views of people's movements, education. He did a little panel this past May, with Howard Gardner at Harvard, along with a educational scholar who I'd not known before named Bruno Della Chiesa, who's a acolyte of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator. And what was so fascinating, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it's one of the better talks you can listen to Chomsky. I think he was rather constrained by the way Howard Gardner approached this, but it was what it was. And one interesting analysis that Chomsky gets into in this in relation to Freire and Latin America, the pedagogy of the oppressed and of Latin and of the church, is how Chomsky relates all those things to Pope John Paul XXIII, liberation theology, Freirean, pedagogy, and so forth, in a very fascinating way that obviously is relevant to the Pope, to the current Pope's recent statements. Number 12, Chomsky has been an absolutist regarding freedom of speech and gone to a lot of difficulty in doing so in his support for, in all the way from his support for the French Holocaust denier, again, Forson, regarding his right to teach in his field, regardless of whether he denied the Holocaust or not. and even in the context of Israel, his opposition to academic boycotts of Israeli professors, again, very much goes against the grain of the pro-Palestinian movement, and he takes quite a bit of heat for that. And I have to say, I agree with Chomsky on that. I don't think that academics anywhere ought to be boycotted, in terms of their field and their qualifications for speaking anywhere, ought to be denied the right to speak because of they live in a certain country. That just doesn't make any sense to me. It seems to make a sense to a lot of people, and I don't understand that. Finally, number 14, just a general point about the media and the manufacture of consent. I was reading in one of my favorite Chomsky books, Understanding Power, which is based on more informal conversations he had, talking about the movie, The Manufacture of Consent, and what he thought of it. And the conversation revolved around the fact that he hadn't seen the movie, and he probably still hasn't seen the movie. But from what he understands, but he of course was subjected to people reacting to it. And the sense that he got of it was that people weren't getting it. People thought that they had to join his movement, that to subscribe to his movement. And that disturbs him, because he felt like the media of film somehow contributed in the kind of maybe McLuhan-esque way, the media being the message, to the idea that Chomsky himself is a leader, and he wanted followers. And if there's anything to understand about Chomsky, is that he doesn't think of himself as a leader, and he doesn't want followers. He wants people to take his ideas. He wants activists to take his ideas and put them into practice at not just a local level, at a local to national level, but again from the bottom up. So that's sort of my summary of how I've come to understand what Chomsky has to teach us. It just scratches the surface, but we can go from there.
Thank you very much, David. Important and very worthwhile stuff. You're listening to News from Neptune, the Prophet Without Honor edition on the eve of Noam Chomsky's 85th birthday. And I, who wanted very much to do this program on this subject, actually wanted to depart from it for a moment to pick up a point that Ron started with, and that is the outpouring of sentiment and political reflection buried under that sentiment that followed the death of Nelson Mandela. This is obviously important because of Mandela's importance in the ending of apartheid in South Africa, and no one obviously is going to take that away from him. He was a heroic figure in that struggle. But there's a second aspect to this that I think probably should be mentioned, because it reaches certain heights when people like the Prime Minister of Great Britain sheds tears. One is tempted to think of a large amphibian about Mandela's death, when he was a member of a good number of young Tories who called for Mandela's execution as he was working for the end of apartheid in South Africa. There's a further problem. Hypocrisy is always with us, and that shouldn't be a particularly big problem here. So the hypocritical comments about Mandela and the fact, I think Ron alluded to, that he was still on the America's State Department list of foreign terrorists until about 6 or 7 years ago. I mean, it's certainly been within the decade. Long after he'd retired, in other words, as president of South Africa. But the second and far more troubling matter has been brought up by a couple of articles. Jonathan Cook, writing from Israel, and John Pilger, writing from Australia, are two that I've seen in the last day or two, pointing out that the liberation struggle in South Africa was in fact co-opted by international capital, and that Mandela, too smart not to realize what was happening, acquiesced. And he acquiesced because there was no other choice, apparently. But the notion that he was a covert agent of international capital is not what's being suggested. What is being suggested is the failure of the South African Revolution and the failure of the movement against apartheid. Here's what Pilger writes. The liberation movement Mandela had promised would take over the apartheid economy, including the banks, and a change or modification of our views in this regard is inconceivable. He's quoting Mandela there. Once in power, however, the party's official policy to end the impoverishment of most South Africans, the Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, was abandoned, with one of Mandela's ministers boasting that the ANC's, the African National Congress, priorities or politics were, and I quote, Thatcherite. So who won in South Africa? The familiar refrain that the new wealth would trickle down and create jobs was lost in dodgy merger deals and restructuring that cost jobs. For foreign companies, a black face on the board often ensured that nothing had changed. In 2001, George Soros told the Davos Economic Forum, quote, South Africa is in the hands of international capital, close quote. So, I mean, it's been, the next step is Jonathan Cook's step, that the reason we're getting such praise from Mandela right now is that he was a revolutionary who was finally tamed for international capital, and therefore a model for any other people who might think about along those revolutionary lines. So it seems to me that these are reflections that are important as we witness this outpouring of quite appropriate grief over the death of Nelson Mandela. Turning to Chomsky, which we frequently do here, don't we? Interestingly, both my colleagues start with origin tales. You know, how I came to find out about Chomsky, how I came to learn from the master. I've got one too. I knew who Chomsky was. I was living in Boston. Chomsky was at MIT, which is more or less in Boston, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. One of my good friends at MIT was a protege of Chomsky's, and I knew sort of roughly who he was through the days in the 60s that Ron was talking about, when his political importance was recognized in the anti-Vietnam War movement. But I actually had never met him or heard from Chomsky until one day early in the 70s, and I could pin it down probably if I wanted to, because what happened was that I went down to MIT and heard a lecture which Chomsky actually gave a couple of other places at that time, was since published in various forms and still with some effort available on the web. And the lecture is called Government in the Future. Now this is this is 40 years ago. 40 years ago he wrote about government in the future, and he set out a paradigm of various ways we might think about government. And it's cast in the terms of 40 years ago, but still very much worth reading, because what he's suggesting, what he finally wants to argue, is the position that we were describing a few minutes ago, libertarian socialism, sometimes called anarchism, if you get the footnotes right and explain what you mean by it, but essentially a notion that depends on the sort of historical analysis that comes from Karl Marx in the 19th century and the political analysis that comes from 18th century classical liberalism. The marriage of those into a coherent political view is set out with that sort of historical sophistication that David was referring to in this classic lecture, Government in the Future. I was absolutely blown away by it and have been a Chomskyan ever since. It was a conversion experience. And in that lecture he says, and I quote here, I think that the libertarian socialist concepts, and I warn you once again about that phrase, and by that I mean a range of thinking that extends from left-wing Marxism through anarchism, are fundamentally correct, and that they are the proper and natural extension of classical liberalism into the era of advanced industrial society. Now, be clear what he's saying here. Chomsky, who is sometimes called a communist by American politicians on the right, I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. Chomsky, out of that political milieu that I sketched a moment ago, has been a severe critic of communism, if communism is understood as Marxism-Leninism, a severe critic of Marxism-Leninism from the left since he was a kid. And the critique, which is finally a critique of the Leninist model of political organization, that authoritarian top-down notion of how one does politics, is very much a part of the left, an essential part of the left, and indeed I think practically almost all that's left of the left in America today. Chomsky has said in an interview that he gave 5 years ago, "I should say that the place where I am most feared and despised," is Chomsky talking about himself, "is probably in left liberal intellectual circles." That's his phrase. Those are the ones, he says, who hate him most. If you want to see a graphic indication of this, take a look at one of my favorite journal covers, which is framed and posted right outside my door, the door of his office. It's the more or less official journal of left liberal intellectuals, The American Prospect. The journal still exists. It was put together originally by essentially refugees from the Clinton administration. So the left liberal strain, if that's the way to put it, in the Democratic Party. It's a more or less official journal of left liberal intellectuals, The American Prospect, and the cover depicts the terrible circumstances in which they try to survive, the enormous forces that are virtually destroying them. This is about as purple as Chomsky's prose ever gets, and you'll see why. In the picture, two figures are depicted, two faces, sneering and angry. On one side is Dick Cheney and the Pentagon, and on the other side is me, Chomsky. The left liberal intellectuals are caught between these two huge forces. This depiction is indicative of the paranoia and concern that there might be some small break in liberal orthodoxy. The liberal intellectuals, and not just in the United States, are typically the guardians at the gates. We'll go this far, but not 1 millimeter farther. And it's terrifying to think that somebody might go a millimeter farther. This extends throughout the major media, too. So yes, the United States is a very free country. In fact, it's the freest country in the world. I don't think freedom of speech, for example, is protected anywhere in the world as much as it is here. This was 5 years ago. This is before, but you know, this is Chomsky, I'm sure, still holds these views. But it's a very managed society. It's a business-run society, carefully managed, with strict doctrinal requirements and no deviation tolerated. This would be too dangerous. And he points out why it would be dangerous. The political establishment, both political parties and the political class, is on many major issues well to the right of the population. On health care, for example, the population is to the left. The establishment has been so forever, and the real fight about Obamacare has been to try to bring the population back into a point of view that's compatible with the business community. That last sentence is mine, not Chomsky's, but I take it it's what he's saying. The same is true for many other issues. So permitting issues to be discussed is threatening, and permitting deviation from a kind of party line is dangerous and has to be carefully controlled. And one of the ways it's controlled, Ron referred to this important book that's on the table in front of us here, Manufacturing Consent, that is the important ways in which the United States has always formed the popular mind. The film from that book, Manufacturing Consent, by the way, that was referred to a moment ago, was made by a Canadian called, I'm getting his name wrong, Akbar?
Akbar.
Something like that,
yeah.
Who died just recently, as a matter
Actually,
of
it was the other guy who died.
Oh, was it?
think,
I thought it was
yeah.
Akbar. Oh, okay.
I
Well,
could be wrong, but
no?
I think there was two guys, and it was the other one
And
I'm pretty sure who died.
David talked about this film.
Peter somebody, I forget his name.
I think that may well be. Anyhow, you can find the DVDs around. You can find it online, probably.
You can watch it on YouTube.
Beg pardon?
You can watch it on YouTube.
Watch it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Very much worth saying, and it does a pretty good job of summarizing what Chomsky is saying in this important book about how the how consent is indeed manufactured in America, and how we come to an arrangement such as the one we have. So Chomsky's position illustrates what seems to me one of the more important issues in American political discussion today. There is a tremendous split between the liberal establishment. By the liberal establishment, I mean President Obama and everything to his left, everything that agrees with him in that area. The split between that and the Chomskyan left, if you like. The left liberals are sitting there, the Romney-Obama axis is in the middle there between Cheney on one side and Chomsky on the other. And what that tells us is that we finally have to make a terminological distinction between liberal and left in this country, where liberal refers to what we normally talk of as the left of the Democratic Party, perhaps, and left refers to this position that Chomsky has outlined, which is indeed to the left of Marxist-Leninists, if there are any still around. So part of our problem here is the recapitulation of language, the recuperation of language, I suppose. Finding some way we can talk about politics in which the language has not been colonized to the point that it becomes unusable. And I think we may have just a couple of minutes left in the program to make our own contribution to that in Coburn's Corner. Coburn's Corner is our homage to the late Alex Coburn. One of his last writings was a pamphlet called Guillotine, in which he nominated cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words for elimination. And we try to do a little of that here, too. You have candidates for Coburn's Corner, gentlemen?
Yeah, I want to nominate a couple of terms to be terminated.
Exactly.
Again, on this Newsmax site, ultra right-wing site that I keep getting mail from every day. They use a lot.
It excites you, doesn't it, Ron?
Yeah, the verbs slam and rip. So one person.
It's the new Batman movie.
Yeah. So are you going to slam Obama today, or rip him, or rip me, or?
That's interesting.
Who are you slamming? These are really tough-sounding monosyllables. Really heat things up by. Well, one celebrity has slammed another, and this is the fodder of the popular press, the mass media, and so on, and a lot of celebrity gossip that really annoys me. But anyway, that's just a personal reaction. So, are you slamming or ripping anyone today, David?
But that's a fascinating observation.
Every day.
Because I mean, you're talking precisely. You quote this right-wing site that is talking about various political positions or various views or various people, I guess, whose views are to be slammed in. At the very moment, our political leadership is slamming missiles into hillsides in Pakistan and houses in Yemen and so forth, and ripping, quite literally, to shreds men, women, and children around the world. We transmogrify the language into a metaphor.
I agree. I absolutely agree. We have a very violent society, and
but I mean,
vicariously violent society.
In a way, but the very vicariousness insulates us from the reality.
Yes.
If Pat Buchanan is being slammed and ripped, and then turns up next week on the same show saying the same sorts of things, we don't have to worry about it too much, and we don't have to think about that. We're responsible for slamming and ripping children apart. In the rest of the world.
Every disagreement.
It's a way to neutralize the language.
Every
almost.
disagreement and criticism is now called a war. And remember, I complained before about Target.
But that's to blind us to the real war, to the real effects of war.
Yes.
And its real nature.
Yep.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
You've got a candidate for
Well,
Coburn's
I
Corner?
wanted to mention something. Maybe if we don't have time, we can get back to it. But
Okay.
the News Gazette editorial board seemed to fall in love for a while there with the phrase called with the phrase that if something can't last forever, it won't.
Yes.
And they were applying it to things like Social Security and the national debt. A very lazy way of thinking about how the world works and or doesn't work. And I saw this pop up several times to the point where it became a nominee for Coburn's corner. And I'm sure there are, it might be something that's come and gone and after the fact already. But when you see the phrase, if something can't last for forever, it won't. I'd say watch out to see in what propaganda context that's being used.
Well, it has an interesting propaganda background. That's called Herb Stein's law.
Oh, okay.
And it's named for the father of the actor, television guy, Ben Stein.
And bad economist.
And bad economist.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
his father was an economist, and perhaps even a little better, but he was economic advisor to Richard Nixon.
Right.
In the Nixon administration. In fact, I think maybe he was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for Nixon, and coined the phrase that the editors of the News Gazette are using.
I've seen it most often applied in the context of exponential growth processes, but
Yeah.
which they cannot continue forever, and so
Yeah,
at some
but
point there has to be a break.
When you see it more commonly, it's about some government program or some debt, or Detroit's bailout or
Yeah.
pension problems. It's not in the rightful context of the environmental limits that we certainly need to attend to.
We have only a minute or two left, and I was going to do something slightly different with Coburn's Corner today. I was going to suggest some language that instead of being taken to the guillotine should be reprieved and indeed promoted, rescued perhaps from the how did you put it, Ron? The big job? But in any case, and that is a word that seems to me we need more and more. The word is neoliberal. Neoliberalism, and I'm finding it more and more necessary as we try to understand contemporary politics and politics of the generation we've been speaking of right now, the generation of Noam Chomsky, to use that word and to use it in a consistent fashion. The best account of neoliberalism is still David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism, although it's not been the book itself was published before the recent unpleasantness in the economy, before the Great Recession. But neoliberal is a term that needs to be used with some precision to get straight and get clear, and with that as a tool, try to understand exactly what has been happening in the American economy and the American polity for the better part of 40 years, the fruits of which, if that's what they are, we're harvesting now. But I don't think there's any time.
Just one footnote.
Sure.
The another important article about in terms of Mandela's passing in South Africa by Patrick Bond on the Counterpunch website also discusses neoliberalism and some of the things that you were referring to previously.
I think we may have occasion to bring these up again next week, perhaps, gentlemen. You have been watching News from Neptune. If this program has interested you, you might want to check some other programs here on Urbana Public Television, notably Democracy Now!, which on Tuesday of this week ran a special about Chomsky, including a new animated film having to do with his work and bringing together the two sides of his work, the linguistic and political side.
Which they actually made him watch.
In fact, those programs or those discussions on Democracy Now! Are available on the web. You can pull up Democracy Now! Website and see those that Tuesday program that has Chomsky's the Chomsky film discussed, and also Chomsky himself talking about his own intellectual formation and his application of it to political questions, including the question of East Timor, which is an example of the sorts of politics of this generation that would have gone down the memory hole without the work of people like Chomsky and the attention to the real policies that the United States is following around the world. Democracy Now! Is shown here every weekday morning at 7 a.m. and again in the afternoon at 5. The Big Picture with Tom Hartman is every weekday morning at 8. These programs are now streaming online, as we are too here at urbanapublictelevision.org. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been Ron Szoke and David Green. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page as well. And I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you. And happy birthday, Noam.